We begin the day planning and paying for a Ukraine that doesn't exist yet. Today in London, delegates from 60 countries came together at a conference on rebuilding Ukraine. The World Bank and the government in Kyiv say that after 1 year of the Russian invasion, reconstruction costs will run more than $400 billion. Now, that amount already seems too low with the war now firmly in its second year. Ukraine says that it will need a 21st century Marshall Plan. Well, much of the money will come from the European Union and the U.S., but many Western lawmakers, they have promised to use frozen Russian assets to foot part of this bill. Ukraine's allies agree that the reconstruction effort will be the largest here in Europe since the end of the Second World War, and they agree that reconstruction should start before, not after the war has come to an end.
It has been called Europe's new Marshall Plan, the largest reconstruction project on the continent since World War II. At a fundraising conference in London, Ukraine's president says there is more to it than just bricks and mortar.
The eyes of the world are looking at us and at whether we will defeat Russian aggression exactly as freedom deserves to win, that is without compromising our values. Also, the world is watching to see if we will restore normal life in such a way that our transformation will land an ideological defeat on the aggressor.
The host of the conference announced UK's backing for Ukraine to the tune of £3 billion.
With this and everything that we do here, we are sending a message that our support on the battlefield and beyond cannot be outlasted, and that Ukraine's incredible spirit will prevail.
EU Commission President Ursula von der Leyen made an appeal to private investors to help in the reconstruction efforts.
Together we gather here. We need the private sector to step into, because it is you, the private sector, with your invaluable expertise and your financial firepower that will help Ukraine realize its dreams. You're here today at this conference, and we really need you, and we know we can rely on you.
While the German foreign minister called for the need to link Ukraine's recovery to its EU accession process.
To make recovery a truly European endeavor.
The World Bank estimates that the reconstruction effort will cost more than $400 billion, a figure that will only rise as the war grinds on.
Well, I want to bring in again Anastasia Fedik. She's an assistant professor of finance at the Haas School of Business at the University of California at Berkeley. She's also a founding member of the NGO Economists for Ukraine. Anastasia, it's good to have you back here on the day. Let me ask you, how much money would Ukraine need for reconstruction if the fighting stopped tomorrow?
Yeah, so there's several aspects here. There's the direct infrastructure damage that Russia's attacks have inflicted. That's in the ballpark of about $150 billion. That's already quite sizable, but of course that's not the entirety of the damage. The damage to the economy that has spilled over from those infrastructure losses, that totals closer to about $500 billion. So the market for the eventual reconstruction is roughly in that ballpark, upward of $500 billion.
The program that is taking shape that we saw at the London conference today, is that the Marshall Plan that Ukraine needs?
Yeah, so I think there are several important factors in terms of the eventual reconstruction program for Ukraine. The first of those is how will it be coordinated, right? And kind of on one extreme, there can be very centralized coordination done by the federal government. It's kind of everything planned together. On the other end of the spectrum, it can be very decentralized. And we've seen some of that, some pledges from individual cities in Western Europe to individual cities in Ukraine. And I think either kind of end of the spectrum can potentially lead to inefficiency, and the optimum lies somewhere in between. I think it's important for individual communities in Ukraine to have their needs heard, to own a lot of the reconstruction process, but for there to also be some coordination so that we don't have redundancies and we don't have inefficiencies. So that brings us to the second question, which is what is the right approach for that coordination? And here, I think the best approach is a technocratic, separate body that will have less political incentives and a long time horizon to kind of oversee and coordinate this effort. And from that perspective, the Marshall Plan that was done for Western Europe after World War II was a pretty good model. And then finally, kind of coming back to the question of ownership of the reconstruction process, as I pointed out, it's important to have the local communities own that as much as possible. But there's also benefit to having a lot of that be in sync with the European Union. So EU accession for Ukraine and reconstruction can readily go hand in hand.
Yeah, I don't know if it was the finance professor I heard speaking there, or maybe the auditor, the tax auditor speaking there when you were talking about technocrats controlling or overseeing this Marshall Plan. Are you worried about corruption in Ukraine with that huge amount of money flowing into the country?
So to be honest, my experience working with at an NGO that has been coordinating a lot of things in Ukraine is that at this point in Ukraine, the sensitivity to corruption is almost more debilitating than corruption itself. People are very hypersensitive, and things sometimes can stall or not get done because everybody wants to make absolutely sure that everything's kind of correct to the letter. So I think at this point, Ukrainians are really trying super hard and maybe even a little bit too bureaucratic in that regard. So I would honestly say that corruption is not my main worry, but I think kind of having institutional alignment between Ukraine and the EU framework, I think that will be very beneficial.
The original Marshall Plan, it took shape after World War II. How important is it that this program for Ukraine, that it gets up and running even as the fighting continues? I mean, the end of the war is nowhere in sight.
Yeah, I think it is important to do it in a timely fashion for several reasons. First of all, there are kind of two parts to Ukraine's rebuilding. One is the immediate needs, and one is kind of more long-term reimagining and kind of reconstructing. The immediate needs, I mean, Ukrainians have been rebuilding from February 24th, 2022. Russia has been destroying civilian infrastructure, energy substations, schools, hospitals. All of those things have been rebuilt. They're continuously being rebuilt for a year and a half. So that, of course, is very urgent for people to continue their lives, for the economy to continue going. And so that is the support that kind of Ukraine has been also receiving from the West on a month-to-month basis. So that, of course, is urgent. Now kind of turning to more long-term recovery for Ukraine. As you pointed out, the Marshall Plan took several years after the war to really take shape. So there's definitely scope for us to be planning, implementing, and starting now. Right? The Ukrainians on the front lines are fighting their battles, they're laying their lives, and once they win their battles, the least that economists and investors can do is be prepared to start the process of recovery straight away. There's a lot that we can do already now in terms of fiscal policy planning, in terms of kind of institutional frameworks, in terms of figuring out the financing. And so it's not too early by any means. And then finally, I would like to kind of point out what Russia's goal in this war has been. It has been to subjugate Ukraine. And when that doesn't work out, to destroy it. So we've seen that this month with the Kakhovka Dam. And so I think kind of signaling strongly that we are all prepared to do what it takes to really recover and rebuild. I think that will be a very powerful signal to Russia that its strategy is not working out.
The voice of reason and responsibility tonight, Anastasia Fedek of the Haas School of Business. Anastasia, as always, we appreciate your time and your insights. Thank you.
Thank you.